This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Specifically about the Rambam and the Gemara on their own. They both give like health recommendations, and the Gemara says something about like cabbage for your digestion or beets or food. Also, in terms of the Gemara on science, that's like bugs being created spontaneously. Like, how accurate is the Gemara on science and health, and has nature really changed over time?
Yeah, so there are many different interpretations about this issue, about Chazal's views on science, on medicine, on health. First of all, it is important to note a very simple observation. The Gemara gives various recommendations about health, and the Rambam gives recommendations on health, and the Rambam himself does not use the Gemara's recommendations, which indicates at least the Rambam understood that they were medical recommendations, not halachic ones, and the Rambam substituted it with his own medical recommendations. So as a result, that would indicate that on matters of science, medicine, health, Chazal are not speaking with any type of Mesorah Misinai. They are simply the wise and the scholarly people of their generation, and those things could change. Now, at the same time, let me point out that even if you assume that with respect to medicine and health, the recommendations of Chazal are just recommendations, we actually do discover that there is a lot of wisdom in them. For example, there's a whole diet book based on the Rambam's diet. The Rambam talked about nutrition and exercise as being necessary for health. So the truth of the matter is, we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss ancient wisdom, but be it as it may, it does not have the imprimatur of Torah itself on it. Now, this is an approach that some people don't like, but again, this is an approach that the Rambam articulates, the Rambam's son articulates, and it goes back to Rav Hai Gaon, that there are two areas. When Chazal speak on Halacha, the Torah or Hashkafa of life, or the moral values of life, they are speaking as emissaries of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they were given the authority and the ability to teach us everything about Halacha and everything about morality and everything about the philosophy of life. When they speak about scientific or the human body, Gashmiistic matters, they are speaking as wise people, very wise people, but they are not speaking as authoritative religious authorities. This is a very well-known idea that, as I say, goes back to Rav Hai Gaon, who is the greatest of the Gaonim, and the Rambam and many other Rishonim say it as well. Now, where you get into a problem, though, is this. If you can divide, the statements that deal with health and science are non-binding. The statements that deal with halacha are binding. What happens when you have halachic statements that are based on scientific judgments that prove, or at least seem to be incorrect? The outstanding example, there are many examples actually, but an outstanding example is the halacha that's in the Gemara, that you're allowed to kill lice on Shabbos, because the prohibition of killing animals on Shabbos is only if they sexually reproduce, and lice, the Gemara says, do not reproduce by male and female. They reproduce by spontaneous generation, the decay of matter, dirt, sweat, and the like. Mimela, it's mutter. Now, spontaneous generation was a widely held scientific belief. It wasn't just Chazal. The entire ancient world, Greeks, Romans, all believed, because they saw, basically what they saw is they saw food rotting, and in rotten food you're going to find, I don't want to take away your appetite, but you'll find maggots, insects, all sorts of things. So the belief was spontaneous generation. Chazal went with that. However, it was discovered with Leeuwenhoek, with the discovery of the microscopes and all of those things, that there is no such thing as spontaneous generation. Rather, even lice have Mr. and Mrs. Louse, get together, and they have little children. Now, so what's going to be? Once we establish that lice sexually reproduce, are we now going to say, is it prohibited to kill a louse on Shabbos? Or do I say, well, when it comes to halacha, what Chazal determined is what they determined? You see, this is a very hard problem, because on one hand, it's a halacha. On the other hand, it's a halacha that is based on a scientific predicate. do I say Chazal made a mistake? Now, this is a very serious mistake, because this is a mistake that potentially matirs an Isser Da'oraisa. See, if they made a mistake to be machmer, so no, all right, there's no particular loss, we're just being machmer. This is a mistake that matired something that would be forbidden min HaTorah, because the lice it reproduces sexually. So here there are many, many mahalchim. There is one mahalach that indeed says when the halacha is based on science, when the science changes, the halacha changes. And therefore there are achronim that say it is asur d'oraisa to kill a louse. Does that mean Chazal were wrong? Well, yeah, according to that svara, they were wrong at the time, but anyone that followed them would not be punished for it, because they were following the psak of the Chachamim. But Rav Dessler, in the Michtav Me'Eliyahu, has what you might call a more mystical idea of the halacha. And that is that Chazal are guided by Ruach HaKodesh to be machavein to the Ratzon of Hashem, even if the reasons they articulate might not be the ultimately correct reason. Meaning to say, every halacha, because the Torah is infinite, may have an infinite number of reasons. Chazal picked a reason based on the science of their time, and even if that has been proven to be incorrect, that doesn't change the halacha, because the halacha represented the Ratzon Hashem. It's kind of a mystical idea of halacha. It's actually reminiscent of a very famous story, and I think I've mentioned the story probably more than once. Rav Chaim Soloveitchik of Brisk, who was such a brilliant, analytical, deep thinker, hated to paskin. He was the Rav of Brisk, which was a big city, but he absolutely did not want to paskin. And whenever there was a shaila, he sent the shaila to the paisek of the door, which was Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, who was the Rav of Kovna. YU is named after Rav Yitzchak Elchanan. That's why it's called Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan. Rav Yitzchak Elchanan was a phenomenally great posek and gadol leader, and Rav Chaim would ask shailas. But the story goes, and this may be an apocryphal story, but the story goes that when Rav Chaim would send a shaila to Rav Yitzchak Elchanan, he would say, "Please just tell me yes or no. Do not write me any explanation." Now, in a way, that's almost painful. When a great Rav is writing a psak to another great Rav, he wants to explain so they can get into a discussion, analyze, argue. Rav Chaim says, yes or no, I don't want to hear any reason. And Rav Chaim said, because if you give me a reason, I'll for sure disagree with it. I'll for sure see things differently. But I know that even when your reason is wrong, you will come up with the answer that is the Ratzon Hashem, because you were given the task and responsibility of being the posek hador. So Rav Dessler doesn't quote this story, but Rav Dessler makes the same point. Now, the Chazon Ish has another point. Chazon Ish approaches it differently. He says, halacha is not based on objective reality. Halacha is based on perceptual reality. By that I mean the following. All of us know you're not allowed to eat bugs, right? Can't eat insects. Right? That's why we check lettuce and don't eat broccoli or whatever, all the different chumras. In Eretz Yisrael, they have become extremely machmer over this, but there is a halacha. You don't eat insects. Now, bad news is, every cracker you ever eat has all sorts of, insects in it. But what's the principle? If they're invisible, if they're not perceptual to the human eye, they're not aser. So the Torah doesn't aser physical reality. The Torah asers reality that is perceived. Tefillin. A bias of tefillin has to be square, right angles. If it's bent, twisted, it's puzzle. Now, you can sometimes take a bias and you can measure it with a compass or some type of tool, and you can see that instead of being a 90-degree angle, it might be a 92-degree angle. But the halacha is, you're not obligated to measure tefillin with a geometrical instrument. You look at it with the naked eye, and if in the naked eye it looks square, that's enough. So the Chazon Ish says the following. based on the idea that halacha is taloi on perception, not reality, then when the Chachamim said that lice do not sexually reproduce, that was not a statement of fact. In fact, Chazal might have known that lice sexually reproduce. But rather, if the sexual reproduction is not visible to the naked eye, then halachically it is characterized as spontaneous generation, even if in point of fact it is sexual reproduction. So the Chazon says Chazal were not mistaken at all. They knew the Metzias, but the actual Metzias was not relevant on the halacha. Now, this is part of a much, much more massive problem. The bottom line basically is, in matters of science, it is entirely possible for Chazal to be incorrect. In matters of halacha, their psak represents the Ratzon Hashem. What happens when the halacha is based on the science, then we have different approaches.
And no one holds that nature change.
Now, again, for certain matters, that is also asserted. Sometimes there is a concept of nature changing. That wouldn't explain everything, but occasionally we bring in the idea of nature changing as well. But that's only, again, that's one approach out of many. So there are many different ways of looking at this. Yeah.
There's a story about Rav Soloveitchik that he monitored cheese for students that was made with synthetic or vegetable rennet without greater supervision. Could the Rav speak about that and bring us off of it?
Yeah. Now, the truth of the matter is, what is the problem with cheese? Like, why does cheese need rabbinic supervision? Now, if you only eat Chalav Yisrael, then you have a problem, obviously. Then, of course, it would have to be Chalav Yisrael. But let's assume that, you don't care about the milk. You drink milk that's not Chalav Yisrael. So what could be non-kosher about cheese? So the problem with non-kosher cheese was an ingredient called rennet. Because how do you make cheese? You have milk and you have to curdle it. It has to congeal and solidify in various ways. And one of the oldest curdling agents that were used in making cheese is something called rennet, which is essentially the stomach lining of an animal, of a cow or a pig even, as it were, that has certain acidic properties, and that causes the milk to congeal. In fact, one of the oldest ways of making cheese was to actually put the milk in the stomach. In other words, a dead animal, you take the stomach and it gets curdled in the stomach itself. In modern cheese making, they tend not to curdle it in a stomach, but they take an extract from stomach acid and they put it in. Now, let's ask a question there. If you make cheese, even with kosher rennet, meaning rennet from a kosher animal, why isn't there a problem of basar b'chalav? I mean, the cheese becomes fleishik. You're actually putting, something meat in the cheese. So here the Shulchan Aruch already says the following rule. The Shulchan Aruch says that milk that is curdled with rennet from a kosher animal is halachically permitted to eat. And the reason is because the rennet is batel b'shishim, because there will always be 60 times milk over the volume of rennet that is put in, and therefore the kosher rennet is batel b'shishim, right? Meat is batel in 60 times the milk, and that's why it's okay. But the Mishnah says in Avodah Zarah that you're not allowed to buy cheese made by Gentiles because they would curdle the cheese with the rennet of a non-kosher animal like a pig. Now, the question is, what is the difference between the rennet of a kosher animal and the rennet of a non-kosher animal? The rennet of a kosher animal should be basar b'chalav unless you go with the svar of bitul b'shishim. So bitul b'shishim could work if it's a treif animal as well. So the Shach and the Meforshim in Yordeya explain that there actually is a rule that even though normally a substance is batel b'shishim, but when it is a chemical agent, a catalyst, called davar hamaymed, it actually creates a chemical reaction, it is not nullified. But that's only if it's a maimed that intrinsically is prohibited, like treif, not a maimed with kosher meat, which is intrinsically permitted, except for its mixture in milk. So the bottom line basically, therefore, is that kosher fleishik rennet will be batel b'shishim, and the cheese can be consumed, but non-kosher rennet from treif animals cannot be batel b'shishim, and therefore cheese is treif if non-kosher rennet was used. Now, the problem that the Rishonim talked about, Rav Soloveitchik didn't invent this problem, is, are you allowed to buy cheese made by non-Jews where the curdling agent was not rennet but was something of vegetarian origin? We would call it artificial rennet or whatever it is. So that's a machlokas Rishonim. Some Rishonim understood that when the Chachamim prohibited buying cheese from non-Jews, they made a low plug. They applied it across the board. Because of the use of non-kosher rennet, they prohibited any cheese manufactured by a goy without supervision. Other Rishonim say it's mutter, because they only answered the situation of the non-kosher rennet. Machlokas Rishonim. So what Rav Soloveitchik paskined in the 1950s, I don't think he stayed with it, was that in the United States, few, if any, certainly none of the big cheese companies like Kraft used meat rennet. That would be very expensive. They used artificial synthetic rennet, and therefore, based on a shita of Tosfos, Rav Soloveitchik said there was no kashrus problem with these commercial cheeses, and he told his Talmidim that they could buy cheese without hashgacha. Now, Rav Soloveitchik's psak was based on Rabbeinu Tam. It's Rabbeinu Tam. Nevertheless, Lamaisa, we don't paskin that way. We actually paskin that it's a low plug. When the Chachamim asert gavinos of Ovdei Kochavim, because of the rennet problem, they made a low plug that even where the rennet didn't exist, it would be asert. So that would be the basis of the psak. By the way, you have an analogous problem. It's not the same problem, really, with gelatin. You know, many types of products have gelatin, whether it's ice cream, candy, pie crust. You know, gelatin is a ubiquitous product. Now, gelatin is generally manufactured from bones of animals that weren't shechted, as it were. So there were many poskim in America going back to the 1940s that said that since gelatin was produced from dried up bones, even if they were from treif animals, they were no longer considered edible in and of itself, and they gave hashgachos on products containing gelatin. However, after World War II, and Rav Aaron Cutler and Rav Moshe Feinstein came, they took a much stricter position. So today, mainstream American hashgachos do not give any supervision on animal gelatin. They will only give supervision on either fish gelatin or artificial gelatin. But it used to be, and again, if you bought products in the 1950s, you could ice cream and the like, it could actually contain animal gelatin from pigs. Some of it was actually from pigs themselves, because they said it was already dried bone. It was different than the rennet. It wasn't because of batel b'shishim. It was because it was dried out and was no longer edible by the time they made the gelatin out of it. So it's kind of a similar problem. Yeah.
Doesn't it say in the Torah that the bones of an animal aren't considered treif or
well, it actually doesn't say that, but the halacha is that it is true that dried bones. Now again, bones that still have marrow are absolutely forbidden, but bones that are totally dried up without marrow are permitted, and that was the basis of that gelatin heter. But the reason why the later Gedolim rejected it was really a factual problem, and that was, when you examine the manufacturing process, you would see that there was still meat on those bones, meaning to say, theoretically, the bones were supposed to be totally dried, having not a bit of moisture in them, but Lamaisa, they saw that there's still a lot of stuff there, so therefore you couldn't be samech on it. So in principle, the psak is true, but you couldn't rely on it anymore. Yeah.
Is abortion ever allowed, according to the Orthodox Jewish position?
Absolutely. Again, abortion is a very serious avera. We certainly do not support a woman's right to choose for any reason she wants. But the Mishnah, it says in Olos, if the woman's life is in danger, there's a mitzvah to terminate the pregnancy at any stage until the baby is born. And danger includes not only physical danger, but it includes psychological danger. So if a woman was raped and giving birth to the child is so traumatic that it's potentially life-threatening, the halacha is that abortion would be permitted. So halacha is fairly flexible in understanding that pikuach nefesh is not just a physical issue, it is also a psychological issue. But nevertheless, other than the mother's life being in danger, we generally do not allow it. Now, there is a famous psak from the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Voldenberg, who dealt with the case of a Tay-Sachs pregnancy. Now, Tay-Sachs is a genetic disease that exists only among Ashkenazic Jews, basically. And if both parents are carriers of the gene, there's a 1 in 4 chance they will give birth to a child with Tay-Sachs. If only one parent is a carrier, there is no chance. In fact, the screening program some of you might have participated in, Dor Yesharim, is designed to eliminate 2 carriers marrying, and that way there's no chance they'll pass the disease. Now, Tay-Sachs is a very, very awful sickness. The child suffers tremendously, becomes blind, deaf, difficulty breathing, and dies typically by 6 or 7, no longer than 10. There is no cure for it so far. Now, you can determine that a baby is going to be born with the disease before the baby is born through amniocentesis. These are tests that are done in the womb. And the question is, would halacha permit the abortion of a Tay-Sachs baby? So Rav Voldenberg actually says halacha permits the abortion of a Tay-Sachs baby as long as the abortion occurs before the last 3 months, within the first 2 trimesters of pregnancy. Rav Moshe Feinstein said about this psak that Hashem will have to forgive Rav Voldenberg for saying such a thing. There is absolutely no heter whatsoever unless the mother's life is in danger. There is no heter to abort a child because of a severe genetic abnormality. So that would be a machlokas. But let me point out that even Rav Voldenberg only permitted it for something like Tay-Sachs, where the baby is going to suffer a lot and die very young. Something like Down syndrome, which unfortunately in the secular world, people will often abort a baby that is carrying the genetic mutation of Down syndrome. That's absolutely forbidden. A Down syndrome child can live 50 years or more. Down syndrome children, I don't want to be stereotypical, but they tend to have happy dispositions. They can be productive within a narrower range. So to simply say, I'll kill him because he's not going to be an Eloi in Rav Kanik Shir or something like that, there is no heter. There's no heter for that. So people have to be very careful. People often lump together, oh yeah, Tay-Sachs, Down syndrome, cleft palate. I mean, you can't compare. This is not just apples and oranges. I mean, this is, apples and the Empire State Building. You can't compare genetic abnormalities. Tay-Sachs is something that is severe, debilitating, agonizing suffering versus some mental disabilities that are challenges. Rav Voldenberg certainly would not have allowed a Down syndrome abortion or the like, which unfortunately in the secular world you often do have. Yeah.
Back onto that milk. If it's true, saying
Say again? Yeah.
back onto the milk.
Yeah.
So in most countries, like the laws when making milk, they're so strict. Like even if it's like because they have standards, and if it's like off by a drop, they can't produce that milk. So then, why is it a problem for people who keep Chalav Yisrael to just drink any milk?
Okay, so this is exactly the famous psak of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Again, just to be sure people know what we're talking about. The idea of Chalav Yisrael, that I'm only allowed to drink milk that has either been milked by a Jew or supervised by a Jew when a non-Jew milked it, that's called Chalav Yisrael, is a Mishnah. The Mishnah says you are not allowed to drink milk unless a Jew saw the milk being milked. And the reason the Gemara says is because we are afraid a Gentile may have adulterated the milk with pig milk or horse milk or donkey milk or whatever it is. And therefore this is the source of the rabbinic decree. I'm not allowed to drink milk or to take milk unless a Jew, a religious Jew, supervised. So now Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote a tshuva in the 1950s in which Rav Moshe Feinstein said that me'ikar hadin, this halacha does not apply when there is a government regulation system that penalizes people for adulterating milk. For example, in the United States, Israel for that matter as well, although Israel, Chalav Yisrael is fairly easy to get. Most of the milk is Chalav Yisrael. But in the United States, where if a farmer, I'm just repeating your question, where if a farmer put in horse milk or pig milk or whatever it would be, and he got caught, he would be arrested and go to jail. So Rav Moshe Feinstein said that the takana of Chalav Yisrael no longer applies, and therefore in those societies you are allowed me'ikar hadin to drink milk without rabbinic supervision. Now Rav Moshe himself said a Yerei Shemayim should keep Chalav Yisrael, even in America. And Rav Moshe himself, in fact, there's a famous story that Rav Moshe once, although his son-in-law said it's not true, but that Rav Moshe once took Chalav Akum. He didn't know that it was not Chalav Yisrael, and when he heard what it was, he vomited. His stomach could literally not hold on to it. But that was Rav Moshe personally, but me'ikar hadin he matir Chalav Akum. Now, even Rav Moshe's heter does not apply to every country. Not every country has strict supervision. Industrial nations tend to have it. America, England, France, Germany. But if you're in India, you never know what they put in and the like. So even if you drink regular milk in industrialized countries, that is not a heter in Mongolia or whatever it is. Now, so if you're asking me why keep Chalav Yisrael, so the short answer is Rav Moshe gave you a heter not to. But the counter argument is the same svara I gave you about vegetarian rennet, and that is, even though the Chachamim had a specific reason for their gezerah, once they made the gezerah, whether it was not eating non-kosher cheese or whether it's not drinking non-Chalav Yisrael, it's kind of a low plug, and they apply it across the board. I mean, that's the fundamental machlokas that we have. Yeah.
I'm not sure, from South Africa, I'm not sure if it is a law or not, but if it is, it would still not be allowed to drink alcohol because they don't have alcohol, the law there is so strict. So even if it is a law, they're not...
Well, you'd have to evaluate the situation, talk to someone who knows the situation there, but you are correct. If it's a law, but people don't enforce it, they're not strict, then ein chinami, you wouldn't have the heter anymore. It would have to be a law that is enforced on a regular basis. And by the way, you might think it's preposterous. I mean, who on earth is going to take milk from other animals? I mean, the milk is always from a cow. Not really, Go to health food stores, they're marketing donkey milk. There's all sorts of milks, that camel milk. Okay, not too many camels in the United States, at least. Here, maybe camel milk may be a problem. In Mongolia, I believe, at least in the desert, the standard milk they drink is camel milk. Supposedly very, very rich in vitamins, but treif, quite treif, right? So you can't do it. Yeah.
What's your cue defense usually for the Shelo Asani Isha question? The feminists right next to the slave god.
Yeah, slave, guy, and woman. Yeah, it's a hard one because every answer you give will not automatically fit the proximity issue. Of course, one famous joke, which has some meaning, is that every person is making the bracha with respect to their wife, meaning to say, thank God I'm not my wife. It's like that, I'm not married to me. So in a sense, it's putting down the man more than it's putting down the woman. That's a famous old word that they say. But I think one way of understanding it is, it's really a very honest acknowledgement that a woman's life is harder than that of a man in many, many ways. Because a woman, especially in modern society, even more so, a woman, number one, is the one that raises the children, typically more than the man. The woman runs the home. The woman also has to be an economic breadwinner. The woman in religious society will often support the man in his learning. And the man is saying, Baruch Hashem, I have it a little bit easier. That I have my learning, I have my davening, and the woman has a tremendous amount of responsibility. So, in a sense, it's almost a praise in some way that a woman is balancing all of these different roles. Another way of looking at it, which is kind of the same answer, but it's a little bit of a different twist, is that a man has a much more defined path in life. At 7:30 you daven Shachris, and then the day goes with a certain order, structure, whether it's learning, whether it's work. A woman, by definition, has less structure. She is not bound by the time-bound mitzvahs. She has to deal with every situation as it arises. So in a sense, you could say, a general and a private knows exactly what a private is supposed to do every second of the day. The general has to figure it out. The woman, in that sense, is kind of like the general, in which, being freed of time-bound obligations, she has to figure out how to optimize her time. And in a sense, a person might say, just like a buck private might say, thank God I'm not the general that has to make all these decisions. I just have my job handed to me. So that, in a way, is what the man is doing. I was talking to a group of kollel wives the other day, not Or Samech, a different kollel, and they were talking about, their husbands are going to go into kiruv, and they were talking about what their responsibilities are, do they have to be teachers, etc. And what was interesting point is that they can kind of decide what type of role they want to have. Different types of Rebbitzins. Some Rebbitzins are very involved in the educational component, teaching other women. Other Rebbitzins are much more involved in strengthening the home and giving the rabbi support, and not necessarily being public figures. So what's interesting is that, people complain, orthodoxy is so discriminating against women, it puts women down. In a way, women have all sorts of opportunities to decide for themselves which way they want their life to go, much more so than a man that is kind of put in a certain groove. So in a sense, there's a certain freedom that a woman has that a man does not have to kind of define their identity. But that could be a very great burden. So a man could say, Baruch Hashem, I don't have that ambiguity as to what path it is I'm supposed to pursue. Yeah.
And I also just hear someone saying then, if it was really just like avoiding burden, but we're also kind of thanking Hashem, like, thank you for the opportunity to not be a goy. Like, being a Jew is the burden. Like, being a goy is not as much of a burden.
Yeah.
It's like a lot, like, I heard the idea that, like, is it true that, when you're asserting that you're not a goy, you don't want to say thank you for making me Jewish, because then it's assuming that you're succeeding?
That's correct. You can't say God made you a Jew, because you make yourself a Jew by the decisions that you make in life. The most you can say is, God gave me the potential to become a Jew by not making me a guy, or by converting, whatever it is. That way I can become a Jew. But a Jew is really what you become. It's not what you're handed. And therefore, we always make it in the negative. God didn't make me this, but I got to make myself a Jew. That's why I mentioned before, again, I've mentioned this before, that when I was in yeshiva, so at the beginning of the Zman, we would give shalom to our Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Breitowitz, Zichrono Livracha, and he would always say, are you going to learn well this Zman? So we would say, Yirtzeh Hashem, if Hashem wills, I'll learn well. So he would always say, no. Hashem certainly wants you to learn well. It's not if Hashem wills. It's up to you. Do you want to learn well? It's not God that decides if you'll learn well. It's you. So the same thing. God doesn't make you a real Jew. God gives you the ability to become a Jew. And you got to become it. And that's why we don't make the bracha in the positive. Yeah.
is the Techeiles we have today real Techeiles? And if it were,
Yeah.
what does that mean about our obligation to wear it?
Well, obviously, the mitzvah of tzitzis d'oraisa requires that you have Techeiles. That is in the Torah itself, and that's a mitzvah d'oraisa. The exact identity of the source of the Techeiles, coming from some aquatic creature called the chilazon, was lost for many, many years, primarily because in Roman times it was a capital offense. You know, the color of the Techeiles, which is a royal blue, only emperors were allowed to wear it. So if you were a Jew that wore Techeiles, you would be killed. So as a result, the process got discontinued because of Pikuach Nefesh. But the modern discovery of Techeiles, and here many of you know this, but just for those who may not, began in the latter part of the 19th century, when there was a great Hasidic Rebbe, the Radziner Rebbe, who decided to investigate about Techeiles, and he wrote many svarim about Techeiles. This is the Radziner Rebbe, and he identified the Techeiles as a secretion of the cuttlefish. The cuttlefish is a fish. Now, many Gedolim came to the conclusion that the Radziner Rebbe was deceived by a dishonest chemist, and in fact the cuttlefish is not a source of Techeiles, but the Radziner Techeiles is still worn by Breslov. You need to know this, that the Stam Techeiles, which comes from another source I'll discuss in a moment, and the Breslover Techeiles are two different sources, and most of the poskim who are pro-Techeiles would passel the Breslover Techeiles because they claim it is not from the Chilazon at all. Okay, so Breslov Techeiles and everyone else's Techeiles are two different things. So in more recent times, the candidate that's been identified is a certain snail, a mollusk, in which there is a gland in the back of the neck, and if you pierce the gland, a secretion comes out. When it's exposed to the sunlight, turns blue, and it seems to be Techeiles. Now, so the Breslov Techeiles, with all the cover to Breslov, I'm just going to dismiss that and say that the poskim do not consider that Techeiles. But the other one is a huge machlokas. Many have come to the conclusion that either it is Techeiles, or at least it may be Techeiles, and therefore you are mechuyev, even on Suffolk, to put the Techeiles in there. And they claim it's a no-lose proposition, because if it's Techeiles, you're doing the mitzvah, and if it's not Techeiles, you just have a blue string on your tzitzis. In other words, fake blue on my tzitzis, according to most poskim, even if it's not a mitzvah, it's not an aveira, so why not do it? Now, in the Haredi world, Techeiles has not caught on that much, although with some exceptions. Meaning to say, the people who tend to wear Techeiles, and there's no particular reason why it should fall, this is not a political issue, but somehow the people who are most careful in Techeiles are Dati Leumi people, and in America, Yeshiva University people. Many of them wear Techeiles. Breslovers wear Techeiles, but their Techeiles is totally different. Among the Haredi world, you have very, very few people who wear Techeiles. And in many, many ways it's a pella, because even though the Gedolim argue, we don't have proof, you didn't prove the case, etc. So let's say there's only a 50% chance that it's Techeiles. 40%, 20%, 10%. You certainly can't say that it's so unproven that there's no basis that it could be Techeiles. The most you can say is the rayos are not 100%. Okay, but just because something's not 100%, if there's a 90% chance I could fulfill a mitzvah, or even if there's a 10% chance I could fulfill a mitzvah, why not do it? It's a very hard kasha. I don't have a 100% answer for this. The standard answer they'll tell you is that the identity of Techeiles has to be established through Masorah, through an unbroken tradition. And once the unbroken tradition has been broken, you cannot reestablish it by archaeological evidence. You have to wait until Mashiach comes, someone that has the exact Messiah. But in truth, I don't understand why that is a halachic imperative. If Hashem gives you a mitzvah, then you have to figure out how to do the mitzvah with whatever tools you have. So if you have a Messiah, that's the best way of establishing what something is. But if you don't have a Messiah, you don't say, I'm not going to do the mitzvah because I don't have the Messiah. What you say is, I'm going to do the best that I can. So I really have a tzarich. Now I myself do not wear Techeiles because my Rosh Yeshiva did not wear Techeiles, and I say, if they didn't, I don't. But I don't understand why I don't. Maybe I'm just confusing you because if you're going to ask me, should you wear Techeiles? I don't know what to say. I mean, I think you should. I think I should. But I don't, so I can't tell you to do it either. It really is a tzarech in gadol for me. Because people are so zoyer to do mitzvahs, even if there's a little bit of a chance they're getting it right. Why should we be mevater on something that potentially is a very, very precious mitzvah? So it's a tzarech. Yeah.
So if you hold that the Techeiles is the real Techeiles, is it usher to wear since it's without Techeiles?
It would appear that it is. Now, it's true that the Mishnah says in Menachos that you can fulfill the mitzvah of lavan, white, without the Techeiles. But that just means when you don't have Techeiles. But if you might have Techeiles, it would seem that you should have. Now, this raises another question. I'm told, you may remember the great gadol Rav Pinchas Scheinberg, who was nifter a few years ago. And Rav Scheinberg had he was a great, great man, American, but he had a number of minhagim that were very unusual. One of his unusual minhagim was he wore under his coat like 100 pairs of tzitzis. And nobody knows why. In fact, Rav Scheinberg looked very stocky. He looked like a football player. In fact, he was actually very thin, but he had 100 pairs of tzitzis under his coat. And I am told that 99 were without Techeiles, and 1 was with Techeiles. But I'm having difficulty understanding that, because if he held that this might be Techeiles, then what's the heter to wear the other 999? So there you have a little bit of a kasha, but at least that Maisa indicates that it's shaykh to wear without Techeiles, even if you hold that the thing might be Techeiles, even though logically it shouldn't be that way. So this is a tzarachin. So I'm sorry, I wish I could give you a better answer. But the case for Techeiles, if the case for Techeiles would be totally ridiculous, all right, so Gedolim can say, I don't have to pay any attention to that. But the case is not totally ridiculous. It's a strong case. So, I personally think it's like 90%. So let's say it's not 90%. Let's say it's 20%. 20%, it seems to me, should be enough of a mechayev to do something about it. So, Hashem yoyer inenu. Yeah.
I heard something, I don't know if it's exactly true, but I heard that once you take on a humra, you can't stop Torah. So if you were to, I heard the Malachim Techelet said if you were to wear it, you always have to wear it.
Well, here's the thing. There is no rule like that. The only rule is that when you do a mitzvah 3 times and you didn't say bali neder, it becomes like a neder that you're not allowed to break. But if when you started you said specifically, I am taking on this practice bali neder, then you're able to discontinue it, because the only reason you couldn't is because it morphed into a halachic neder. Right, so that wouldn't be a problem either. By the way, let me go back a little bit about Chalav Yisrael. The Rabbanut in Eretz Yisrael, even the plain Rabbanut, only certifies Chalav Yisrael products. They will not certify dairy products that are not Chalav Yisrael. But the Rabbanut has a very unusual psak going back to the early Rav of Yerushalayim, Rav Pesach Tzvi Frank, who was a great gadol b'Torah, Rabbi Yashiv Zankel. And Rav Pesach Tzvi Frank paskined that the Takanas Chazal of Chalav Yisrael only applied to liquid milk. It did not apply to powdered milk. And therefore the Rabbanut will certify dairy products that contain non-Chalav Yisrael powdered milk. And this is the difference between Ben & Jerry's and Haagen-Dazs. You may recall, obviously, Ben & Jerry's is available all over the place, and Haagen-Dazs is not available except in stores that are not under kosher supervision. And the difference is, Haagen-Dazs is a more expensive ice cream, so they use whole milk in Haagen-Dazs, which is not Chalav Yisrael. Therefore, the Rabbanut will not allow it to be sold, even though it has an OU. OU does not mean Chalav Yisrael. Mashen came Ben & Jerry's is a little cheaper. They use powdered milk, and therefore that is under the psak of the Rabbanut. But those who are machmer, there are many people who are machmer not to use powdered milk that's Chalav Akum, and therefore they will not be allowed to eat Ben & Jerry's, unless it's the special Belzer variety. There is a special Chalav that's made in Israel, but the American Ben & Jerry's is powdered milk. Yeah.
When is minhag given strength in determining halacha?
Yeah, it's a good question. Rav Aji Yosef used to like to make a little joke that minhag and Gehenim have the same letters in them, which means if you follow too many minhagim, you might be breaking halacha, and then you go to Gehenim. So you have to be careful. Well, that's really a key. Number one, if a minhag is violating a halacha, that is treated like a mistaken minhag, and you ignore it. But if the minhag is, number one, consistent with halacha, and number two, represents a view that is endorsed by some poskim, even if it's a minority, it then can become a binding halacha in a community. In fact, there are many things that are absolutely halacha today that really started off as minhag. The example is davening Ma'ariv. Kriya Shema at night is doraisa. But the Shmona Esrei of Arvis, we paskin Tfilas Arvis Rishus. It's a dangerous thing. You learn in the Gemara. Davening Ma'ariv is optional. So a person learns that, and a person says, oh, davening Ma'ariv is optional, so I'll just skip it tonight. Can't do it. Because even if davening Ma'ariv was optional, once the Jewish people accepted it as a custom, the minhag becomes the halacha. So it's a tricky thing. There are whole svarim written on which minhagim are considered to be binding. There are concepts of minhag shtus. There are sometimes a minhag is so unreasonable in terms of halacha that it's called shtus, foolishness, and you don't have to follow it. But most of the time, the Ramah says you should never make fun of minhagei Yisrael, because they could have been established by great gedolim for reasons that we don't even remember anymore. So minhagim are very, very important. Yeah.
Also, Yitzchak said something about girls knowing Gemara, like he gave a heter for. What exactly is the situation where he gave this heter?
Well, okay, the heter, again, these types of heterim were not invented by Rav Soloveitchik. It goes back a lot. First of all, in order to ask why there's a heter, you have to ask yourself, why is there an isser? Meaning, what's the problem per se? Now, granted, women are not obligated to learn Torah, that's for sure. Okay, they're not obligated. But what is the problem with giving a Gemara share to women, at least if it's sneas and it's separate, and the like? So the statement is really based on a psak of the Rambam that says a man should not teach his daughter Torah Shebal Peh. Written Torah is okay, but not Torah Shebal Peh, because she will take, this is what it says, because most women, I think I'm quoting or paraphrasing the Rambam, most women, their mind is not that interested in learning this material, and they will apply it in a foolish manner. They will not use it in a proper manner. So this is what the Rambam says, and this is based on a statement of Rabbi Eliezer in Maseches Sota. Now, there's a commentary in the Torah, on the Torah, called the Prisha. It's one of the great commentaries on the Torah, where the Prisha says the following diuk. This is an important diuk. Rabbi Eliezer and the Rambam do not say a woman is not allowed to learn Torah Shebal Peh. Rather, what it says is a father is not supposed to teach it. So he learns this way. A father should not force his daughter, right? My son, I have to force to learn. I don't force my daughter to learn Torah Shebaal Peh. But if, as an adult woman, which is only 12 years old, she desires to learn this on her own, I am permitted to then teach her. And that's what the Prisha says. This is in the commentary on the Torah. So here's what Rav Soloveitchik said in modern times. At a time when women typically were not educated, they weren't doctors, they weren't lawyers, they weren't accountants. And all of their energy was devoted exclusively to their home, to their children, to their husbands. So Chazal didn't want women to get involved in learning intricate sugyas, because that would take them away from their commitments to their home. But in a society where women get higher education, they become doctors, lawyers, physicists, college professors. They run businesses. So to say, you can be trained in every type of chachma except the chachma of Judaism. That would be perverse, and that was never what Chazal intended. In other words, you could almost say, although it sounds a little negative, Chazal maybe didn't want women to have any type of higher education. So they should be committed to the home. But once you open the door and you have all the other types of higher education, then fakert, a woman needs Torah, because her Torah has to keep up with her intellectual acumen. So that was the basis of Rav Soloveitchik, who actually in Stern College, etc., permitted there to be Gemara classes and the like. Now here's something that's very little known. The Lubavitcher Rebbe took the same position, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe actually said that women should learn Gemara. Now, this is very, very strange. This might be the only statement of Lubavitcher Rebbe that the Chabad Hasidim actually don't follow, meaning they don't, in their traditional schools, called Beis Rivka, that's their Beis Yaakov, they don't have Gemara. But I do know that in their seminaries for Balot Shuvah, they do teach Gemara. Mayanot, which is both a men's school, but they also have a girls' seminary. In the Mayanot Girls' Seminary, they give Gemara shiur to the girls. So they follow the Rebbe's directive for the Balot Shuvah, but the actual Chabad Hasidim don't do it. But that was kind of the idea. The idea was, you don't impose it on a girl, but if she gravitates. When I was a rabbi in Silver Spring, so I used to give a daf yomi shir. I gave a daf yomi shir for many, many years. And there was a woman who would wander in. Now she lives in Yerushalayim. She's a great teacher in different seminaries. And she would sit at another table, very, very tsanua, and she would listen to daf yomi. And I know myself, that there were times when, it was late at night, and I knew that nobody got what I was saying. Nobody got the Gemara. It was too complicated. And I would just have a little furtive glance over to her, and she always got it. She always knew what was going on. So the issue is not, God forbid, that women are not capable. But Chazal were afraid that this would take them away from something that was more important.
So it's not us to teach if a woman's coming into a share.
So this is what the Prisha says. It's not usher for her to learn, and it's not usher for me to teach her if she wants to learn, but you don't impose it as a curriculum matter, unlike what you would do with a man, with a boy. Yeah.
Didn't Rav Soloveitchik also want boys and girls to learn Gemara together? And why is that? I actually don't think that's the case. Even in his own school, if you're from Boston, the main day school in Boston is Maimonides. If they learn together, then maybe that's how it developed. That was not his plan. His issue was not learning together. I saw on Wikipedia that it said that he established the school that way on purpose. I don't know if that's
I'm going to check that. It may not be accurate. He was not a proponent of... In fact, when it came to Mechitza and Shul, although it's a different issue, he was extremely strict. He basically was the one who said, if the only synagogue that's blowing shofar on Rosh Hashanah does not have a Mechitza, it is better for you to miss the mitzvah d'oraisa of the Tiyas Shofar than to go to a shul without a Mechitza, even for 5 minutes, just to hear Tiyas Shofar. So I would be surprised. I don't think it would be characteristic of him that he would support mixed learning, but he did support women learning Gemara. That is true. Yeah.
A similar issue, I think it says, I don't know where, but you're not supposed to teach Goyim Torah.
Yep.
But, pretty much access to Torah everywhere. If they want to, they just Google it.
Yeah.
So let's say we're giving a share and like a guy comes in here and asks a question. He's not looking to convert. He just
Yeah. So that's a big sugya, right? The Gemara says in Sanhedrin, you're not allowed to teach a guy Torah. A guy is not allowed to learn Torah. So let's differentiate two situations. If I'm giving a shir to Jewish students, and someone that's a guy happens to walk in, that's not a problem because I'm teaching the Jews. The fact that he can listen, that's no different than ArtScroll. ArtScroll sends out a book. Any guy can buy the book. That's not called teaching Torah to a guy because I'm making it available to a Jew. But where you do have potentially a problem is, okay, so if he's just listening to my shir, that's fine. I'm giving it to the Jews. But he then asks me some specific questions, and he wants me to clarify to him, maybe in a private conversation, what the Torah says about all of this. So potentially you do have a problem with teaching a guy Torah. So you have to know that there are a lot of exceptions to this rule. First of all, the poskim say you can teach a guy the written Torah, but not the oral Torah. Now that's very difficult because the written Torah is only understood with the oral Torah, but you can talk about Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Number two, you can teach him anything that's relevant to the 7 mitzvahs of Noach, because that's his chiyuv. And that includes Amunah, Bitachon, Musar, because that's connected to believing in Hashem, and that's also connected in a just society, which is Dinim. And number three, you can always give short explanatory answers. So, for example, if you're at the Kotel and you're taking your lulav and your esrog, and a Christian stops you and says, "Can you tell me what that palm branch is? It reminds me of something that Yashka did," or whatever it would be. You don't say to the guy, "Sorry, I can't teach you about my religion." You can always give short answers, but you try not to give lengthy explanations. So it all depends. If you're Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, Torah Shebichsav, short answers, these things are permitted. You are also permitted to teach a guy Hebrew. The Hebrew language is not considered teaching him Torah. And if he's in the process of converting, the Marsha says you can teach him Torah. In fact, that's their policy in Or Sameach. If somebody is in a conversion program, even if they are technically not Jewish, they can go to every Gemara shir and the like, based on the ruling of the Marsha. Okay? Yeah.
Is there a halachic source for keeping 3 hours between meetings?
Well, yes. Let me explain something. The Gemara, there is no Gemara that says 6 hours. That does not appear in the Gemara. The Gemara says that the waiting period is the time between the morning meal and the afternoon meal. Now, in a 12-hour day, people would eat breakfast at 6 a.m. and they would eat lunch at 12, so that's where you get 6 hours. The 3 hours is, who says that you're talking about a long day? Maybe it's a short day, like the winter, where there may only be 3 hours. So the interpretation of 6 hours, 3 hours, even 1 hour, is simply based on how to understand the statement of the separation between morning meal and afternoon meal. So that is the basis of 3 hours, and that is the minhag, and the community that follows it is the German minhag. Those Yidden who come from Germany, they kept 3 hours. If you're from Holland, you even get an easier way. Holland kept 1 hour. That was the Dutch minhag. But if you don't know where you come from, you should do 6 hours. That's the official standard rule. Yeah.
Most of South African Jewry, well, not most, but a big percentage of South African Jewry will keep 3 hours, and they're all Litvish Jews.
They're all
Litvish Jews.
Litvish Jews. Yeah, I don't know how that happened really. because Litvish Jews kept. I know that there are Litvish Jews that I know. Litvish Jews kept 6 hours. The only thing I could assume is that when so many of them stopped being Orthodox, and then they were convinced to keep kosher again, perhaps the only way they could be convinced would be something that would be a little bit easier. But based on family tradition, it's very illogical that they would keep 3 hours. 3 hours was the German minhag, it was not the Litvish minhag. Yeah.
Where's the 5 hours and a little bit more?
No, so that's simply a machlokas. What do we mean by 6 hours? Does it mean 6 full hours? Or does it mean entering the 6th hour? Or does it mean a majority of the 6th hour? Those are simply variations of the 6-hour minhag, in which the 6th hour can be interpreted 3 different ways, ranging from 5 hours and a minute, 5 hours and 31 minutes, or actual 6 hours. Okay, so be well. We'll have a good.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.